whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's geothermal, whether it's fusion, whatever it is, like a lot of people just get really excited about the technology itself. I mean, if you could just compare everything apples to apples, coal to natural gas to fission to fusion to wind to any renewable.
Fidelity's clean energy ETF is down 28% in the past year. Invesco's solar ETF is down 35%. iShares Global Clean Energy ETF down 26%. And the Invesco Wilder Hill Clean Energy ETF is down 31% in the past year. Is clean energy now tainted for investors, or should you be backing up the truck to scoop up these bargains? I don't necessarily know the answers, but my devilishly handsome friend across the Zoom screen does, or at least he knows more than I know. His name is Simon Erickson. He is the founder of 7investing.com. This is a stock research service I know very well, or I know about it very well. He's also my former colleague at the Motley Fool and a former alternative energy analyst at a large integrated energy company whose name you certainly know. Simon, welcome, and thank you for helping us to unpack this.
James, thank you as always for the kind introduction and the compliments as well. It's always nice to be here on the show here with you.
My pleasure. So lightning round first. Don't overthink this. These are not the real questions, just to kind of warm up. Let's get to know you a little bit. Favorite 80s TV show or movie?
Oh, gee. Well, it's before the 80s, but favorite movie of all time was definitely Monty Python, The Search for the Holy Grail.
Got it. Yeah, strong pick. More a lover or more a fighter?
Somewhere in between the two, maybe.
That's probably a healthy balance. On a Tinder profile, that sounds like a winner. Although you don't need that, just hypothetically. Happiest moment in your life?
Birth of my two kids.
So equally happy for each one, obviously, right?
That's
Gotta be
right.
fair. All right. So back on the business questions, let's go back to what I led with these ETFs down. Why are these ETFs down so much? And I asterisk that, Simon, because XBI, the biotech ETF, biotechs have a lot in common with clean energy stocks. They're incipient technologies. Often the cash flows are expected to come way in the future. It got killed too after 2021. However, last year it was up like 8%, still underperforming the S&P. But S&P was up 26%, but not underperforming it by 50 or 60 percentage points. So why are the clean energy stocks still lagging so much when even biotech has recovered a bit?
Yeah, James. So, I mean, as you know as well as I do, every industry is unique in its own way, right? And the energy industry is no different. Of course, this one is one that's very capital intensive, though. Any energy project is not just a neat idea that just happens out of nowhere. It's kind of a process that can take several years, if not decades, to get new technologies to a commercial scale. Renewable energy is no different. A lot of this, I saw in my former role, like you had talked about, it's always a process. There's a lot of investment that's required. It's not just, hey, guess what? We're going to have fusion technology next year. It's going to have to be these large projects that have to have funding that attach to something, perhaps the government's funding, and then also companies that have their own economics to how they can actually make this profitable. And I think that a large part, there's a lot of factors, but I think maybe one of the large parts of being that these renewable energy ETFs are down is funding is a lot more expensive. Interest rates are higher. It's harder to finance these projects. And companies that don't have really deep deep pockets for projects might be having a difficult time accessing capital right now.
I've heard that the costs are coming down. Costs of borrowing, are coming down for at least utilities. Now, if you're totally new to the space, utility is kind of the polar opposite of a clean energy startup or new company. These are well-established companies protected by, essentially government-mandated monopolies. It's a lot easier for them to borrow than it is for Simon and James's, wind turbine startup to borrow money, but their costs of borrowing are already starting to come down. And with the Fed cutting rates pretty soon, supposedly in 2 or 3 months, let's say, do we potentially have a big, nice tailwind for this sector?
It could be. We saw NextEra Energy earlier this year kind of cut its growth forecast and said it's not going to really be increasing the dividend, at least at the same pace as it did before. So much of these projects are, NPV, net present value based. And then you say, okay, how much do you need in funding for the project itself? After you're throwing off the cash flows, how much of that is going internally for things versus giving paid out to shareholders? I do think that lower funding costs is a net positive to this sector. But again, if we're investing in this sector, if we're talking to investors that want to invest in energy, you kind of have to think about it in 3 parts, James, right? You've got these neat technologies as the first part, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's geothermal, whether it's fusion, whatever it is. Like a lot of people just get really excited about the technology itself. and then they just stop there and they say, okay, I'm gonna put my money to work. But there's actually two more parts to this too, right? The second is like, how are you actually going to raise funding to bring this technology to a commercial scale that can actually be affordable if it's electricity or energy, whatever it is that you're wanting to produce. And then the third piece of it is like, what does a company have an interest in actually deploying these for? Can you actually get the unit economics of this to work out? And you and I, in the last couple of weeks and months, have chatted a lot about that. It's a long process, and it doesn't happen overnight. But you can't just look at any one of those in isolations. This is something that takes a long time to deploy.
Yeah, it's if you're jumping into the space, there's a lot of moving pieces, and one of the things you wrote in Seven Investing, Simon, about the levelized cost of energy, which I'm going to butcher the explanation, and I think you can do a better job of this, but I think it arises because you have very different ways of getting power, and it might depend on where you live, what the regulatory climate is, what the natural situation is. If you're in a hydropower friendly area, then you're probably going to have more hydropower, like in Canada or parts of the Pacific Northwest. If you're in a solar friendly area or wind, you might have more of that. Coal has traditionally been the backbone of the U.S. energy grid. Not so much in recent decades. We have obviously not just renewables, but natural gas has been a big thing. But anyway, back to LCOE, which, if I understand it correctly, it's basically this idea of, look, you've got some projects like a nuclear plant, which cost a huge amount of money to build, but then you don't have so much of a fuel expense day to day, or hydro or wind. Conversely, coal, expensive to build, but then you've got to buy the coal all the time, right? And so how do you compare all these things? And the levelized cost of energy is sort of a way to do that. And people criticize it, but I don't think they so much criticize the notion of having the framework. What they're criticizing is the inputs, like what are you baking in, what are you leaving out? Is that broadly correct?
James, you didn't butcher it at all. You actually nailed it. That was a perfect explanation of what the LCO is.
I read your explanation well. That's probably why.
It was fantastically said. It's the average total cost, all things considered, per unit of output of electricity or of energy, right? It's typically dollars per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour. And if you could just compare everything apples to apples, coal to natural gas to fission to fusion to wind to any renewable, you can't just look at your fuel input costs, which might be higher for something like coal or natural gas, where you've got to ship things all over the world for inputs for creating the fuel. But if you could put that on the same kind of level field of something like a nuclear plant, which costs $40 or $50 billion up front just to build, how can you think in terms of the output of power that you're making? All other things considered in terms of just dollar cents, are they equal or not?
And if I'm stereotyping here, but if I'm kind of the right wing position, someone who doesn't like renewables so much will say, hey, a lot of this stuff is not accounting for the LCOE is not accounting for the intermittency of renewable power. You got your wind now and then, but it doesn't always, the wind doesn't always blow. Or my solar power is great sometimes, but I've got to use the grid other times. So am I properly accounting for that? Conversely, on kind of the more left side, you might say, hey, wait a minute. Coal, hydrocarbons have this huge emissions footprint, and pollution costs the world billions and maybe trillions of dollars, I don't know what, per year in terms of health effects, corrosion on buildings. If you've been to China, you see that the cars, the buildings, they're corroded from the air pollution, right? So there are clear externalities. They're not necessarily baked into that algebraic equation on both sides, and you can debate which one should be included or not. Is that a fair assessment?
And I hope that we are going to debate for the next 3.5 hours which one is right.
Exactly.
We shake our fists in the air and say, depending on the
See who can scream louder. Yeah.
Thank goodness. Okay. No, I mean, keeping this from an investment, it's absolutely right. You've got a lot of inputs, you've got a lot of things you got to consider. Generally, those that believe in renewable energy or innovation in this space, look at the learning curve. They say that if you put enough money into manufacturing facilities, you're going to get your costs down. And as you have a new technology gets deployed more and more often, you're going to learn about how to do it more efficiently. And so your costs are going to come down. And so some of these, sexy technologies that maybe are not very efficient or mature yet can get there, right? Solar panel efficiencies. We used to think that silicon-based PV, photovoltaic cells for solar was going to tap out at 26% efficiency in terms of the amount of energy that's absorbed by the sun to actually convert it for useful electricity. Like 25% was generally kind of considered the best. But then you had kind of like these thin films, and then you've got this perovskite, new materials, things that can get that to like 35% in the lab, but you're still not putting them on top of people's houses yet. You've got to learn about this. You got to figure out how they're going to handle storms and anything else that could impact the cells. And so generally, it's kind of the trade-off of like, you've got to have that investment, you got to have that patience, but there is more efficient output for most types of energy production that you can get if you want to invest into the innovation. And that costs billions of dollars, sometimes tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. The government, at least in America here, has not been shy about putting money to work on that, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, for whatever reason we named it that, James, we should have just called it, Biden wants to promote solar power.
Weirdest name piece of legislation. Yeah, totally. I mean, well, who can be against reducing inflation, right?
That's right. That's right.
Let's just have it. We love Children Act, right? I mean, and make it about something totally different.
But you've got $369 billion in outlays just for energy from that. You've got another $400 billion from the Department of Energy to fund the projects, get the loans out there and get them in the ground. And you've seen a lot of companies have been putting those subsidies to work, whether in tax credits or loans to get projects in the ground. Kind of exciting if you're an entrepreneur that wants to work in the energy industry.
Right? Yeah, I want to, and I'm glad you framed it with those three things. The tech side, there's the funding side, and then kind of related a little bit is the project economics, more on a specific level, right? Because it's one thing to look at the tech. Some people just get excited about the tech, and that's cool. But in this case, the way utilities are structured and even power distribution, there's a lot of either monopoly or quasi-monopoly dynamic in this space, and it's not as simple as just having a cool EV car or something. I was reading that solar power has become 64% cheaper between 2010 and 2020. And I'm sure from 10 years before that, it's even more drastically cheaper. That's cool. I was going to ask you about the Inflation Reduction Act. Regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, the reality is the government, and in Europe, I would say even more so, governments are really pushing in the West towards this net zero. There's a lot of money allocated. How should investors frame this, start to make sense of this, and think about winners from losers? I mean, I'm going on a random tangent, but I like to mention that in the U.S., we've had over 2,000 car companies come and go. And now we have 3 or 4. We've had hundreds and hundreds of e-commerce companies in the 1990s, and we have Amazon and, maybe kind of eBay, right? 45,000 crypto coins in 2017. I don't know how many now, but it's certainly fewer, right? So new industries start out with a whole bunch of entrants, and then there's a small number that actually survive. So what is Simon's playbook, the 7 investing playbook, if you will, for finding the survivors with an eye to your framework? It's not just about the tech, but you got to map the funding too.
It's interesting because it's very hard. The crystal ball is always cloudy on this, right? We knew in Clean Energy 1.0 that if America just started getting a whole lot of PV manufacturing, we had these kind of designs coming from America, that it was definitely going to work, right? There's going to be solar panels on everybody's home. And then we realized we were relying on China for a lot of the materials. There was kind of these negotiations, if you want to call them that, on, the trade disputes and things like that happened. A lot of companies lost a lot of money in kind of this first wave of clean energy as you kind of realize the cracks in the system. Where are the inconsistencies? What are the things you're not expecting? Whether that's for lithium materials, whether that's for solar, PV, whatever it is, you've got kind of a supply chain that's very challenging in the first phase. And I think that the second one, we're going through this again now. Again, we've got almost $1 trillion in funding outside of infrastructure funding, which is in addition to that too, that the money's there, James. And, we're kind of learning from this. Just to give an example of kind of how this plays out is a lot of these companies start as private, right? So this company called Cubic PV wants to bring solar jobs to America, right? Went out, got $100 million from the DOE, Department of Energy, to build an internal domestic molten silicon plant, right? Rather than the silicon ingots that you have to saw and there's all this dust and all those losses and stuff like that, they want to do this a completely different process. Domestically here in America, they want to hire a bunch of people and build this $1 billion facility and have up to $600 million of it government funded. And that's cool, right? $600 million out of 400 billion that's kind of outlaid for this. But you don't really know how efficient that's going to be until you start hiring people, you start getting those out there, you start deploying them, you start seeing how efficient, how they hold up out there, different technology, different process that you're going with. I think that in the honest answer in this is it's very hard in that first phase, and just that technology or doing something new phase, to reliably pick the winners, right? Even Elon Musk said that he thought that Tesla early on had less than a 10% chance of actually succeeding as a company. He thought 90% chance that Tesla was going to go bankrupt, and now it's one of the world's most valuable companies just because of the execution and him scaling up in the gigafactories and everything else that he has. Same thing with anything in energy. You've got to scale it up. You've got to figure out where your faults and where the chinks in the armor are, address those, and get bigger as you scale up.
Yeah, and I think Musk's assessment is pretty wise. I mean, that shows some self honesty. I mean, that maybe he's lacking these days, but at least he had it in the past. Um, yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, the good thing about being a public markets investor is, although the private markets are where you can make a whole lot of money if you do it right, the failure rate is just incredibly massive, and you're inevitably casting some kind of a net. It's all about how many stocks you need to buy to find the one or two winners, because most are going to lose. And so in the public markets, things are a little bit more advanced. The companies are a little bit more mature. They've basically always got revenue, maybe not profit yet. Would you send somebody who says, all right, this sounds cool. These stocks have gotten killed, but I like the long-term thesis. The government's putting a lot of money at this. We are, the earth is warming year by year. It seems like last year's the hottest year on record. Maybe this year. I'm an ice climber, right? And this winter is terrible. I'm just sitting here at home, and it's getting worse. I thought last year was bad. This year is worse, right? So it's not happening in a decade by decade sense. It's almost in a year by year sense. So my point is, someone who sees all these catalysts and says, all right, I want to buy these stock, would you send them more to an ETF first, or would you say, no, there's too much garbage, hunt and pick some specific names?
The comment you made earlier about the ETFs is a good reason to avoid ETFs, right? There's too much garbage. There's too much that's going to go belly up in there. Even publicly traded companies, there's still a lot of uncertainties. We gave one example there of a private company. Let's talk about a publicly traded equity, NuScale Power, right? NuScale Power was trying to do small modular reactors. This is nuclear fission. It's basically a big nuclear power plant, miniature size, right, James? Like 10th of the
Yep.
size. And so he said, okay, you don't have to put $50 billion into a plan. Maybe you want to put a couple $1 billion. Maybe you could catch on with some municipal districts or, some power producers that wanted to do this. And so they did a demonstration project out in Utah. They're cutting the funding on that, right? And NuScale is now laying off nearly half of its entire staff just because the economics are not going to work out, at least anytime before the year 2030.
It was just way too expensive, right? If I understand correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it had promise, right? There was a lot of funding for it. You had kind of Dow Chemical and a whole bunch of other companies saying, hey, we want nuclear, we want small scale nuclear, we want to displace carbon, and carbon emissions and stuff like that. But it just didn't work out. And this is a publicly traded, multi-billion-dollar company at the time. You're going to see failures like that, James. But again, should it scare everybody out of this space? I tend to think that if you kind of put a small basket approach together, knowing that you're not going to bet 100%, this is not an industry where you're going to do that, but you can kind of take some calculated bets that you follow up on every year or two. I think there's a way you can play this. You can invest in a couple of different companies at the same time and still do okay with the basket approach.
So let me put you on the spot then. So I mean, what you're saying makes sense. So if I bucket, because we're talking about alternative energy as a broad category, but it's actually solar. There's wind, technically there's geothermal, hydro. I don't know if that's alternative or not, but it's quasi. And you can even make a case that nuclear is sort of a semi-alternative thing, in the sense that we might see a nuclear renaissance now. Nuclear is clean power. The only problem is, what do you do with the waste? And that's not an insignificant problem, but I think the world is coming to the realization that's perhaps a much better problem than being reliant on Russia for imports of fuel, or just polluting the earth. So my question is, do you think someone would be wise to diversify equally across some of these buckets, or if not, what do you suggest?
Yeah, it kind of if you had asked me that 10 years ago or so, it would be, yeah, we need a little bit of everything. There's going to be an opportunity for every renewable energy technology. I think that now it's much more difficult to scale than people appreciate right now. When you say geothermal is going to be huge. Well, it's got to be the right pockets, of places to do things like that. Even enhanced geothermal, same thing. Wind energy. We think wind's going to go crazy, but it's got to be the right kind of wind resource, tidal resource, all the hydro resource. There's pockets of the world that are conducive to these things, but I think that the only maybe two that I could see really, really becoming, $100 billion companies are the company that cracks solar efficiency at a
Mm-hmm.
mass scale, because every company out there wants to go renewable. Power producers, for utilities and everything, they want to go renewable, and solar is the only one that really is super reliable. And the other is battery storage. Battery storage is it's a feeding frenzy right now. Is this bedlam of all these technologies, whether it's zinc-based batteries, whether it's iron-based batteries, sodium-based batteries, lithium-ion-based batteries. I mean, there's kind of this fight for what's going to be the one battery to rule them all. Elon has gone all in on lithium ion, but there's a lot of people that are saying that's really not even the best one to choose from. And I don't think we've seen the true winner in that yet, but I think that probably between batteries and solar, you're going to see a couple $100 billion companies, $100 billion market cap companies within the next 5 or 10 years.
Wow. That's big, compared to what we're at now. So if you hypothetically had a third child and who says maybe this is an adolescent kid, and I mean, it's a weird conjecture, right? But and says, okay, Dad, I've got some money to allocate. I have a high risk tolerance. Roughly, how much should I put in energy, and then how much should I allocate to alternative energy? And this is not advice to anyone except your hypothetical kid, but what kind of thinking do you have to that kind of question?
Yeah, part of the funding for Seven Investing came from an early investment I made in Solar City, right, which got
Mhm.
gobbled up by Tesla, and then of course Tesla became this huge company later on. So I mean, like even in picking small winners early enough before that kind of inflection point can be a good way to do it. But I mean, James, I've generally kind of stayed away from the energy industry
Yeah, yeah,
in terms of long term investments. It's just too fast of a pace. Solar PV, even if you're all in on solar PV, something better and newer is going to come out 6 months from now. That's why we say kind of, basket approach, take maybe small, 1-2% positions. You pick a
got it.
couple
That's
of them.
conservative then. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
even in fossil fuels, right? They were a pariah, and then Putin invaded Ukraine, and suddenly, they're on fire again, and we realize we need them. But there was a lot of volatility in that process, very unpredictable. And even with regulation, I would say in the U.S., anytime you have something dependent on regulation, or at least largely connected to regulation, you're dependent on the choices, the decisions of a relatively small number of people. A public utility commission could suddenly sway one way or the other, and yes, you can kind of predict based on where they're at in the country what they've tended to do in the past, but things change too.
Yeah. And I mean, the first wave of it will be electric vehicles, right? Everyone's talking about the big opportunity in industrial, big opportunity in smart grid and battery storage and all this. But like the first commercially ready opportunity for energy is going to be vehicles, because you're already seeing $500 billion committed by the automakers to make the next gen EVs. That's where the opportunity is: better batteries, longer
Yeah.
charge, better performance.
So if somebody's watching this now, just to make it more tangible, with a pen and paper in hand, the person has been waiting to write down some names, some tickers. What names are you looking at, if any, in this space?
Yeah, I mean, this is not even a direct play on the energy industry, right? By the way, James, I was not prepared for this question, so this is off the cuff. Bear with me.
Oh,
If you can
that's
write
how
down
that's
his
how we
name,
roll here. No
send
problem.
complaints to James Early. We can put his mailing address on this episode.
You're capable of it, though. I know you, Simon.
I think that an interesting one is Wolfspeed. The ticker on that is
Okay.
WOLF, right? So they're making silicon carbide materials. One of the devices that comes from those is a traction inverter that goes into an electric vehicle. This
Hmm.
is a very
Hmm.
different type of supply chain and materials that are used in electric vehicles versus internal combustion engines. But silicon carbide can get you 15 to 20% longer range in an electric vehicle than a silicon-based inverter itself. And so Elon and Tesla figured this out. They put it in the Model 3, and now every other company out there is saying, yes, we need a silicon carbide-based traction inverter. This is the second hardest material behind diamonds. It's very, very hard to
Wow.
manufacture. It's a very wide band gap. It can handle the high temperatures, the very, very high voltages that are necessary for you to store more charge and get a better bang for your buck out of your car. But if you look at the projects, every automaker that's serious about EVs is deploying silicon carbide right now. And that's why Wolfspeed's building 3 state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, 2 in the U.S. and 1 in Germany right now, to keep up with demand and signing long-term supply agreements. So maybe one that's worth howling over, James. Wolfspeed for
I like it. I like it. And what's the ticker one more time?
WOLF, just as you
Oh,
would
whoa,
describe.
it's super.
Wolf,
It
Wolf.
can't be easier.
Yep. Uh-huh.
So if somebody's watching this saying, all right, I like Wolfspeed, I want to learn more about Wolfspeed, but I also want to learn more about other ideas Simon has. What else is on the Seven Investing scorecard? Where would you send this person? I'm guessing Seven Investing, numeral 7 investing.com is the best place.
Yeah, that's right, James. And you can even get started for $1. For $1, you get your first week of trial of everything we have to access. We want to make it as easy as possible to join, look at all the recommendations, see if this is right for you at kind of almost a zero risk, just to get in and start poking around. We've got all of our recommendations. We publicly and very transparently show our performance for every one of the picks. Energy, we've got some energy names on there, some that you recognize, some that you might not. But it's not just energy, too. We're looking at commercial space economy right now. We're looking at biotechnology. We're looking at AI. Kind of our lens is what is innovative and how's that changing the markets that are out there. And how can you profit from those as an investor?
And a lot of those innovative things, as we know, kind of took a beating in the past couple of years. And now with rates coming down, it may be a good time to revisit them, too.
Absolutely.
So awesome. Simon Erickson, thank you so much. A pleasure, as always, to chat with you. And as always, thanks to you guys for watching us at home.